For this week's scene breakdown, I chose The Body in the Library by Agatha Christie. This is the second Miss Marple novel that she published. It was actually 12 years after the first one, and she ended up publishing a dozen novels featuring Miss Marple, and that's not counting all of the collections of the short stories. Miss Marple is an old spinster amateur detective that gets called in when there are cases that the police can't figure out on their own. Now, in this particular scene, there is no Miss Marple. We just have two other characters, and I chose this because it's a fun scene between a husband and a wife. So this scene is actually more about the argument between the husband and wife than the actual crime of the story, but it's really fun to look at. It's a little shorter, and it's a little easier to identify all of the 5 commandments and the objects of desire. So as always, I'm going to go through really quickly how we identify these things within a scene, and then we'll take a look at the scene. The inciting incident is the first of the 5 commandments of storytelling. The 5 commandments of storytelling track the change in your story, and since stories are about change, we have to have all 5 commandments in every part of your story, or it doesn't work. So we're looking at these at the scene level, but the inciting incident is the thing that knocks your protagonist's life off balance. So your protagonist has something that they're already doing. They assume they know what's going to happen next. They're following that path. And then some ball of chaos comes in and knocks their life off balance. It interrupts what they were planning to do. Now, out of that inciting incident arises an object of desire. All of the conflict and tension within your story comes from the objects of desire. All of the active characters in your scene are actively pursuing their object of desire, and the conflict that rises out of that is what creates the conflict and tension within a scene. So we always have to have a clear object of desire. And you can word the object of desire like this: the protagonist wants A without having to B. So in every case, the protagonist wants something, but they want it without having to do something else or give something else up or have something else happen. So from here on out, the protagonist is pursuing their object of desire. They're trying to get A without having to B. Then we run into a series of progressive complications. And progressive complications are where the protagonist tries to get what they want. They try to get A, and something gets in their way, some force of antagonism. And remember, the antagonist is not the bad guy or the villain. It is anything, a person, part of the environment, anything that gets in the way of the protagonist getting what they want. So the first thing they try, it doesn't work. And the tension between them getting A without having to B gets stretched a little bit. And then they try something else, and that doesn't work. And they try something else, and that doesn't work. And each time that rubber band in between is getting stretched and stretched and stretched. And there can be more than 3 progressive complications. There can be less than 3 progressive complications. But at some point, we reach a progressive complication turning point. And that is the point where something happens and the protagonist realizes they're not going to get A without having to B. The world where those 2 things can exist at the same time, that rubber band has snapped, and they can't have their cake and eat it too. They can't get A without having to B, which then leads to the crisis. And the crisis is they have to make a decision. It's a question. Are they going to do A and they have to do B, or are they just not going to get A, right? So they're either going to get what they want, but they have to do the thing they don't want to do, or they're not going to get what they want. That's the crisis. And the climax is when the protagonist acts on the decision. It's when they actually take the action. So it's not when they make the decision, it's when we watch them act on their choice, which leads to the resolution. What happens as a result of the protagonist making that choice? What happens in the arena, the setting, the world, and how do the other characters respond? Okay, so let's jump in and look at Scene 2 of The Body in the Library by Agatha Christie. Now, I highly recommend you stop right now and you read the scene before I do the annotations and go through it myself and try to identify the 5 commandments and the objects of desire yourself. So there's a link to a clean version down in the description. So pause the video, go read that, try to identify the 5 commandments and object of desire yourself, and then come back and check your work against mine. Okay, so the first thing I like to look for is the inciting incident. Where does the protagonist's life get knocked off balance? And that happens right here. So this is where Miss Bantry, somebody has run in the room. So somebody's run in the room and says there's a body in the library, and she's trying to figure out what's going on. She can't really figure it out, and so she applies an urgent conjugal elbow to her sleeping spouse. And that is the inciting incident. So that is what knocks the protagonist's life off balance. Colonel Bantry was sleeping. He was planning on continuing to sleep, and then she elbowed him, and that knocked his life off balance. So out of that comes the object of desire. And remember, the object of desire is always worded, the protagonist wants A without having to B. Now, in this particular scene, what he wants is to stay asleep, to stay in bed. That is what the protagonist wants. He wants to stay in bed. And the thing that he doesn't want to have to give up, the thing he doesn't want to have to deal with, is making his wife, Mrs. Bantry, really angry. So he wants to stay in bed without having to make his wife angry. So then he goes through several different things to try to make her do that. The first thing he does is he tries to pretend that he's still asleep. Now, Agatha Christie is nice enough to not say that he's pretending to be asleep, but if you've ever had this happen to you, you know that he's awake. He's just trying to pretend like he's still asleep, hoping that she'll leave him alone. And she does not stop. Wake up, Arthur. Did you hear what she said? And so this is the first progressive complication. So the first thing he tries is to just pretend to be asleep, and then that doesn't work. So that's progressive complication number 1. So let's look for progressive complication number 2. So this is where Colonel Bantry, she keeps waking him up. She says, hey, Mary came in here and said there was a body in the library. And he's kind of like, what are you talking about? And they go back and forth a little bit. And then he says, nonsense, old girl, you've been dreaming. No, I haven't. I thought so too at first, but I haven't. She really came in and said so. So this is progressive complication number 2, because progressive complication number 2 is him trying to get her to believe that she was just dreaming, and then she pushes back and says, no, I wasn't dreaming. So that's progressive complication number 2. So the next thing he tries to do is get her to believe couldn't possibly be a body in the library. And she says, no, I suppose not. And so then she rallies and goes on, but then why did Mary say there was? So this is progressive complication number 3. Colonel Bantry tries to get her to think that there's no way there could be a body in the library, and she just won't let it go. So then he decides to try to get her to believe that she must have imagined it, that she must have imagined Mary coming in. And then she says again, I didn't imagine it. And so this is progressive complication number 4. So he's just going through each thing, trying to get her to just leave him alone so he can go back to bed. So then he starts speaking to her kindly. Oh, it must be because you're reading these mystery books. And she's like, well, perhaps, but will you just get up and see? And he doesn't want to get up and see. And they go back and forth. And then this happens right here. With a sudden burst of energy, Mrs. Bantry jumps out of bed and pulled back the curtains. The light of fine autumn day flooded into the room. This is the turning point. So this is progressive complication number 5, but it's also the turning point. So this is the point where Arthur realizes there is no way that he's going to be able to stay in bed and also not anger his wife, which leads all the way to the climax. And the climax is the point where Colonel Bantry takes action, where he actually makes a decision and takes action. And so that's right here. This is when Colonel Bantry wrapped himself in his dressing gown and left the room. So this is the climax. So the crisis is rarely on the page. There's rarely a point where somebody says, are you going to do X or are you going to do Y? But we know what it is. When I look at the crisis, I like to look at it in 2 ways. First of all, we just look practically, what is he deciding here? And this is, will he stay in bed or not? That is the crisis. That is what he's thinking. Am I going to stay in bed or am I not going to stay in bed? The other way we can do it is by looking at the object of desire. Remember, the object of desire is the protagonist wants to stay in bed without angering his wife. And so we know the crisis is going to be around that object of desire. So in this case, the question is, will he stay in bed and anger his wife, or get out of bed and keep his wife happy? That is the question. That is the crisis. And we see the climax when he actually gets out of bed and puts on his dressing gown. And then, of course, the resolution is he goes down, and sure enough, there is a body in the library. So everything that happens after is the resolution. And so this is how we look at a scene. And we see this scene is working really well. There's a clear inciting incident that creates an object of desire out of the protagonist. And then he tries lots of different things to not have to get out of bed while also not angering his wife. That's the thing I want you to see with these progressive complications. If any of these had worked, he would have been able to stay in bed and his wife wouldn't have been able to get mad at him. But at the turning point, when she jumps out of bed and pulls open the curtains, he knows at that point, if I stay in bed, she's going to be really angry. So he ends up getting out of bed. And that is the climax, which leads to the resolution. All right, that's the breakdown of Scene 2 of The Body in the Library by Agatha Christie. Studying masterwork scenes is one of the best things you can do to level up your craft as a writer. And I've got 2 ways for you to continue doing this. First of all, check out the other masterwork scene breakdowns that I did here on this channel. A link to one of those is going to pop up on your screen soon. Also, we have masterwork guides published at storygrid.com/books, where we go scene by scene through an entire book. And it's a great way to study a book. And we also have an Agatha Christie book that we've done before. So go check out those as well. If you're wondering who I am, my name is Tim Grahl. I'm the CEO of StoryGrid. And I'm the author of Your First 1,000 Copies, Running Down a Dream, and The Threshing. My partner, Shawn Coyne, is the creator and founder of StoryGrid, and everything we teach on this channel and everything at StoryGrid is based on his 30-plus years as a writer and editor. To find out more about StoryGrid, go to storygrid.com, check out all the free resources we have available there, and sign up for the newsletter. That's where we send out the latest and greatest stuff. But as always, thanks for being a writer. Thanks for being a part of our community here at StoryGrid, and I'll see you next time.